With the cost of living rising very quickly, it is concerning to think that those who are already struggling may be put in an even more uncomfortable financial position. Minimum wage within Australia at the time of recording this video is $20.33 per hour, and I wanted to break down just how difficult it might be for some to live off of. Welcome back to my channel. My name is Reece, and in today's video, I am going to be providing an overview of what living off minimum wage looks like here in Australia. The main thing I'll be focusing on towards the end of this video is to determine whether or not it is actually possible to do this within the country at this point in time. One thing to definitely take into consideration as I go through some examples today is that the cost of living will differ depending on where you live in the world. If you live on a different continent, in a different country, in a different state, or even a different suburb, it's obviously going to fluctuate depending on people's circumstances, what they have access to, and what things like the minimum wage are. And it will also depend on the lifestyles that these people choose to live, as well as the number of dependents that might rely on the support from some of these people to get by. I guess what I'm trying to say before I start laying out some very specific scenarios with some very specific information is that there are lots of parameters which will make everyone's scenario different. Okay, setting that aside, let's see what we're working with living off of minimum wage within Australia on a per weekly basis. At the current rate, it is going to be $772.60 for a standard 38-hour work week. Let's start by categorizing the three types of living expenses that fall into what is known as HEM, or the household expenditure measure. The three categories contained within are basic expenses, discretionary expenses, and non-basic expenses. Basic expenses cover the must spend money on to survive category. I'm talking about things like food, utilities, rent or your mortgage, any types of transportation to do your job, any type of communication, same thing again. Anything that's going to keep you functioning on a day-to-day level, that falls into the basic expense category. Discretionary expenses cover things that we don't need to spend money on, but will choose to do from time to time, such as getting takeout, maybe buying some junk food, spending money on alcohol, gambling, or forms of entertainment. And non-basic expenses are categorized as luxury items. Think of things like going on a holiday or hiring help, such as a cook, a cleaner, or maybe a gardener. Now, the purpose of differentiating between these different categories is really important because for the sake of today's video, I'm only going to be focusing on one scenario where we look at basic expenses and where I look at the other two categories as if they never existed. I'm not even going to consider them as part of this weekly breakdown based on the sum of money that we have access to living off of minimum wage. So as a one-liner, our scenario is going to look at a person who is perfectly happy only spending money on basic expenses. Let's also say that our individual is single, they have no kids, they are living in what's known as a standard size house, about 20 kilometers from the local CBD, and they're living with two other roommates. Let's say they drive a relatively average price car, nothing too fancy, and they live in the same city as myself, being South Australia. It's going to be the easiest way to break down some of the costs because I live here myself and have that context. And I think using South Australia as the example is a good idea because South Australia definitely isn't the highest cost of living location within the country. Fun fact, that would be Melbourne and Sydney, followed by Canberra. So depending on how much money they have left over, it's going to paint a pretty clear picture of just how harder it would be to live in some of those more expensive cities on this type of wage. Okay, moving on. What expenses are we going to consider for our person who is living on minimum wage, spending money on basic expenses? I think I'm going to keep this list relatively simple. My list is simply going to consist of grocery expenditure, rent, transport being insurance, registration, petrol and maintenance costs for the car that they drive, any type of communication costs being their phone bill and their internet bill, and finally their utility bills for where they are living in that share house. And I think you can see where I'm going with this. I'm going bare bones. I want to see just how much of that minimum wage, that total weekly pay, is eaten up by the absolute bare necessities before any other expenditure is considered. So now that I have defined this list, let's go through each one and put some costs to those categories and see what the total comes out to at the end. Starting with food, I asked a bunch of my friends to give me some insights into how much they regularly spend on their groceries each week, and all of them eat relatively healthy and they don't splurge too much on any fancy items. And the feedback that I got was that they spend somewhere in the realm of $50 to $100 per week to get everything they need. So let's make this one bang smack in the middle at $75 per week for our person living on minimum wage, spending money on groceries. Next up is rent/mortgage, and I've decided to go with renting. If they're on minimum wage, it's most likely that they're not going to be paying a home loan, so I figured that's the direction I would go. Anyway, I'm going to base this off of someone who is living in a 3-bedroom home within 15 kilometers of the CBD, and this data is pretty widely available, and roughly what you're looking at paying is about $200 a week in rent for something like that. Okay, next up is transport. Let's say they drive their car to work 5 days a week and they fill up their car of petrol once per week. Standard unleaded petrol is sitting somewhere between $1.50 and $2 a litre at the time of recording today's video. For the sake of being conservative, let's round up to $2 per litre just to keep it simple. A standard tank is roughly 60 litres, so if we do some quick maths, that's going to work out to be about $120 per week spent on petrol. Now, that might seem a little bit high, so we'll factor maintenance costs into that as well, where let's say it only costs them $80 or $100 a week. The excess out of that $120 can be fed into their maintenance cost pool for the year of spending. Registration for a standard vehicle here in South Australia comes out to be $600 per year. So if you divide that by 52 weeks, you come out with $13 per week. To insure a vehicle here in South Australia as well, you're looking at about $600 at the minimum for a decent enough cover, and that's going to feed into another $12 a week going into that total expenditure. Onto communication now. The cheapest mobile plan that I could find was with a company called Belong, which is one that I personally use myself. I am on the $15 plan, which gives me 3 gigabytes of data per month, which actually isn't that much. It's not really enough, and there's a reason why I'm on it. I've actually made a video talking about the topic about how to find the cheapest mobile phone plans and why I'm on what I'm on. So feel free to check that video out. I've linked it down in the description below, and now would be a really good time to just quickly hit that like and subscribe button. I really do appreciate the support. It does not go unnoticed, but for the sake of today's video, I'm going to say that the person needs a little bit more data. So we're going to go with the next deal up, being $25 per month for 20 gigabytes of data. Internet costs are pretty standard across the board. You're looking at around about $60 per month, so $15 per week. But let's say our person living with 3 others are splitting the bills evenly. That's going to be another $5 per week for internet access. And finally, utility costs. Let's ignore gas and say that the house is purely run off of power and water. The average power bill for households of 3 annually in South Australia is $1,740, and the average water bill for households of 3 within South Australia is $1,000 per year, which when you add those two costs together and then split them up between our roommates, you come out with $14 a week to cover both your power and water bills every single week. So our combined total across all of the expenses we are considering in this very bare bones living scenario comes out to be $445 per week, which is needing to be spent to get by day to day, which leaves us with $327.35 remaining. Now, I want you to keep in mind that the scenario I have just run through and broken down is only considering the optimized scenario. This is in a city where the cost of living is definitely lower than other capital cities within the country. I am only considering the absolutely necessary expenses that if they didn't spend money on, they would definitely have some impacts and probably put some strain on their day-to-day life. I have not considered any type of leisure spending whatsoever. I have not factored in if this person might require some type of medication to get by. I have not factored in a dependent, maybe a child if they had one, which is going to chew into those costs as well. And I definitely haven't considered any type of emergency replacement that might be required due to wear and tear where something breaks. If any of these other considerations came into play, it would definitely chew into this surplus of $327 per week. And I'm going to give you 2 very simple examples of where and how these things can happen without it being planned for. I had a flat tire on my car. It went down as I was driving to work and I accidentally ruined the tire, not knowing what was happening until it was too late. That cost me an arm and a leg. Not really, but it did cost me a little bit of money to fix up, more than the surplus they have on a weekly basis. The other thing happened was I went through a red light, 0.1 seconds. I entered the zone too late and got flashed, $600 fine. That one hurt. That was pretty rough. For someone who is only sitting on $327 a week in surplus, this is going to be pretty damn hard on their everyday weekly expenditure. This is a person who is in the scenario I've given, the optimized scenario where they have $327 left over. Imagine someone who doesn't have anything left over. These types of occurrences do happen on a day-to-day basis, and they can really do some serious damage. And I just wanted to put that into perspective here because I have considered such a perfect scenario where it looks like, yeah, $327 a week left over, no probs. That's pretty good. That's probably more than people on good salaries save. The point is that it doesn't reflect well on reality. I just wanted to see that bare necessity expenditure, which the number that came out was somewhat higher than I thought it would be. It was over 50% of their take-home pay going to something that they have to spend money on no matter what. And that's pretty scary, being on a salary that most of it's going to that bare minimum expenditure without even factoring anything else in. The thing that I assumed from that scenario that definitely would chew into that $327 per week if it wasn't the case would be if the person was not living with other roommates, especially in other states, not just where I am here in South Australia, but the cost to rent at the moment is just bonkers. Almost all of their entire weekly wage for the type of property that I've been discussing is going to take up most of that wage, purely because of how bad the rental market here in South Australia is, let alone all of Australia at this point in time. I live in a country where standards have been introduced to make sure that employers pay their employees enough money to get by from one week to the next without having to rely on some type of external or government assistance, which isn't always necessarily the case. The fact that a minimum wage exists within the country is a good thing in my own opinion. However, I do believe that if you had to live off of it for an extended period of time, it would be incredibly difficult to live a comfortable lifestyle on that type of money. And I really don't want to picture what living off minimum wage in the US looks like at this point in time. That is a whole nother story. After doing a quick search on Google, it seems that most people are priced out from even being able to rent a 1-bedroom apartment living on a standard 38-hour work week on minimum wage within the States. Out of 3,000 counties, only 218 of them have an affordable availability of a place to rent, being a 1-bedroom apartment. And I'm assuming that that would still chew into a significant chunk of their weekly earnings. That is a topic to unpack in another video altogether. I think it just really puts it into perspective just how difficult it might be for some living off of this type of money within their respective countries. And that was the overarching point of today's video, was to paint a picture, put it into perspective, and really lay it out there just how difficult it might be for some having to pay well over 50% of their take-home pay for the bare necessities to literally survive on a weekly basis. It not only reminds me that even though I have worked hard for what I have, I am still very privileged to be able to continue shaping my life the way I want to. And it really does make me appreciate the things that I have in my life and the opportunities I've been given. With that being said, I don't really have anything else to cover in today's video. That's the snapshot. That's why I wanted to make today's video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you made it this far into the video and I gave you some insights into this topic, please hit that like and subscribe button down below. Like I said before, it really does help the channel grow, and I really do appreciate the support. And with that being said, I will leave you there. Have a good day, have a good week, and as always, I will see you in the next one. Bye for now.